Hi, everybody. My name is Victoria Ybanez, and I work at Redwind Consulting. Just to tell you a little bit about my background and experience, I've been working to address violence against Indigenous women for probably, well, really close to 30 years right now. I think about 29 and a half years. And way back before we even had safety planning tools. And I've worked several years as an advocate, providing direct service to victims and survivors, victims of domestic violence and survivors of sexual assault. And for the last probably about 17 years, have also been working to provide national technical assistance to tribal programs across the United States. Redwind Consulting is a national tribal technical assistance provider working with the Office on Violence Against Women. And this webinar is supported by OVW through one of our technical assistance grants to focus on working within emergency shelter and transitional housing. So when we think about safety planning and just in a real broad general sense, I think of it as a way that we as advocates work with victims and survivors to help raise awareness about the potential risks to safety as well as the options for safety, and to help survivors to explore options and do that in a way that we are thinking ahead, you know, doing some pre-planning, being proactive in a way to provide survivors with a way to really think through and be responsive to things as they're happening. Safety planning is a dynamic process, and what I mean by that is that it's not something that we do once and we're finished. When we're working with somebody, that it really is about that we incorporate it into the multiple aspects of our work with those people that we're serving. And we will find that there'll be a few points in our work where we will do a very formal process, but as we're interacting, we want to recognize that situations change. So we might have done a formal safety planning process yesterday or last week or last month with this survivor, and then situations have changed for them, which really requires that we really engage more to think about kind of current situations. And with that, we want to do it in a way that that the survivor builds their own skills and awarenesses so that they're able to respond proactively based on their experience and their perceptions, so that it's not reliant on I have to run to an advocate and talk to the advocate about it, that we work with them to develop the capacity so that they can think things through to figure out what their options are in the moment. And the reality is they won't always have somebody else to process it with, so we want to support them in developing the means to be able to do that. So when we think about safety planning, we want to think about it in the different places that the survivor goes to or is at, and that could be safety in their home, you know, places that they go to on a regular basis, whether that's work, you know, going to the grocery store, the children's school place, you know, going to visit their grandmother, things like that. And so we want to think about it more than just in their home, because the reality of people's lives is that we go many different places, and oftentimes that abuser is aware of the different places we go and the things that we do. And so we want to be really incorporating the range of different places and things that a survivor may do. Also, we want to think about and recognize that any person that has experienced domestic violence, they will have a pretty good internal response to recognizing what's happening with the violence. They've been surviving that violence usually for a period of time, and those are some real strong ways that can kind of red flag for themselves. They've got feelings, they've got perceptions. They recognize that with this behavior that it's starting to escalate and it may lead to certain types of other things. And so they themselves are their own experts. We basically have an ability to help facilitate the process to help them recognize how they are an expert and how they, when they see something happening, that it's time for them to, take step X, Y, or Z to help protect themselves or build in the ability to move out of a current situation. So safety plan is going to look at the current risk, and in that, we really want to, as I was saying, recognize that survivors' own knowledge and experience of what's been happening, and so they're going to be able to say, I think this is, this situation is pretty extreme, or maybe this situation isn't as extreme. Maybe I can just do some things and stay in place where I'm at, or the situation is escalated to a point where I've got to get out of here really fast. We want to provide an exploration of options for improving safety, and when we talk about options, we're talking about a whole range of different things. What kind of resources do they have? Where can they go? What are their exit plans? What ways can they be as safe as possible? So say, for instance, they're in a park and it's near a convenience store, and it might be, as they recognize something starting to happen, and maybe their abuser showed up, that they start, as they see that person approaching, they head to the convenience store where there's some other people, where there's a telephone, someone else can call 911, things like that. So they want to be able to think about all of their possible options that are available to them. And in the resources, which are also some of the options in terms of like, where can you go? A resource might be your best friend has said, you can come here, you can pull your car in the garage, we can shut the door, no one will know your car is here. Or, you can go into emergency shelter, or you can go stay at your mother's house, as well as knowing that that it's possible that you've got some money that's been nested away for just this situation, so you've got a little bit of cash to be able to buy lunch for yourself and your children while you're figuring some things out, as well as the other advocacy type resources. So you've got maybe your tribal advocacy, but there might be an advocacy program outside of the reservation that might also be helpful and necessary to access, or in the next town there might be some supporting resources to help. And so you want that survivor to understand and recognize that whole range of different resources and what they can do, and not just that they exist, but how real, are they in terms of being available. Also, when we think about safety, we want to think about it more than just that person, that one individual who's been subjected to the violence. We also want to think about whether or not they've got children. And I would also expand that when we think about within our own tribal community. Sometimes our family is more extended, and we might have our grandma or auntie living in the household with us. And so not only are we considering safety for the children, but we want to consider safety for our household. And then recognizing that how the violence plays itself out. We also want to recognize that in our own tribal communities, that sometimes it's not just the abuser who is the dangerous person. Sometimes they enlist other people to terrorize, to harm the victim, survivor, and that immediate family. So we want to, recognize that and brainstorm that. those other people who may be potential risky people. So we want to recognize that every person's situation is unique. You know, I've worked over the years, and I know that there have been times I've been working with somebody and I hear some of the stories of what they're talking about, and in my mind I'm thinking, you know, wow, that doesn't really sound that serious, but she seems really terrified of it. And I need to realize that maybe in terms of the way it's being communicated or the history that goes behind it, that whatever I'm seeing from that person, that's very real. And that even though I may not, through the words that are being shared with me, view that as quite as risky, the fact that she does, we need to be responsive to that. So as an advocate, we don't want to assume anything, that they know the risk of lethality, they know all of those different situations. I know myself, I got into this work as someone who was formerly battered, and after I had separated from my ex-husband, things really, really escalated. And I believed at that time, there were a couple of times during our marriage where I thought he could have killed me. But after he and I separated, there were some things that he did that were somewhat benign. And I remember a friend telling me, like, what's the big deal? Like one time he had, I lived 120 miles away from him, and he had come and he had put some dried leaves on my dash of my car. And I had told a friend that I was terrified about it, and she was like, what's the big deal? And because of where I was at, I couldn't communicate all of what I was feeling at the moment. But the reality for me, the deeper story, the bigger story to that, was that he had told me at some point that he could kill me, and he could just simply lay me underneath a pile of leaves and nobody would even find me. And that was the clue, was he was telling me that, you know, the pile of leaves, that I was close to that. So I think it's important for us to recognize that each survivor, they may not have all of the language and the words to communicate the severity of the risk of what's going on for them, but will definitely be able to pick up some of the emotions that go on with it to some degree. But at the very least, we always want to trust that survivor, that whatever they say is you know, it's absolutely imperative that we hear what they're saying to us, that if they're saying this is huge, or even if they're saying it with no emotion and a flat effect, we need to be responsive to it and take everything serious. There's some differences in the way we do safety planning, and we need to be able to safety plan with the person who's sitting in front of us. And so whether that's a survivor of domestic violence or a survivor of sexual assault, someone who has been, who has experienced dating violence, or even stalking, we need to recognize those differences in the way we're going to safety plan. And so when we think about domestic violence, it's important for us to make sure that safety planning is focused on what we think or believe or perceive that abuser may do. So we're looking at some of the dangers and some of the different tactics and way that that's going to play out. And as I mentioned before, in Indian country, that abuser may not be operating alone. They may enlist a friend or other family members to engage and do harm. We also want to explore and think about, you know, the needs of the children, and in that we want to put in place strategies in terms of how we're going to move around safely, as well as who are the key people who are going to have information about what potentially could happen. So say, for instance, with children, one of the things that will happen is an abuser will go to the school and say, you know, I'm his father, I'm picking up this little boy, he's my child. And if that victim of domestic violence hasn't communicated some of the risks to the school and have in place a safety plan there, that abuser could step in and walk away with that child. And that can happen at daycare and other places where that child may be at while the other parent may be gone. So we want to have strategies that protect and inform, and then we also want to have like escape strategies. And so as we think about escape strategies, we also want to think about, you know, so how do you get out of the house? So it's not just a matter of lock the door. I mean, that abuser could break a window and come in. Where do we want to move in the house to make our exit, and how do we get to the car and those kinds of things? When we think of sexual assault, the dynamics are different in there. And while there's power and control that plays out within sexual violence, the way we safety plan is different because we're not necessarily safety planning for an intimate partner. Oftentimes, this may be an acquaintance or somebody else that's not as closely connected but can be somewhat connected. We want to safety plan with that survivor for some of the triggers and some of the emotional response to the trauma, so that they have some way to continue to function and move about while managing some of the emotional trauma that may happen as a result of triggers. So, for instance, an example might be one trigger might happen to be smells of that offender when that person raped her. She could smell, say, cigarette smoke or aftershave or something like that on that person. And so she could be just moving about her life in a kind of a normal way and then smell maybe that combination of cigarette smoke and aftershave, and it taps into that trauma response, which brings up a lot of fear and anxiety. And how does she manage that in that situation? What are her options to protect her and to help her be able to respond to that and to be as safe as possible? As well, we also know that in some cases that, particularly in our Indian communities where our communities are much smaller, we know that that offender may not have been arrested and may still be walking about in that community. And so we want to safety plan to recognize that and then to anticipate some of the dangers that could result as a result of that offender, that perpetrator still walking around in the community and may be engaged in some intimidation tactics to prevent that person from reporting if she hasn't reported, or if that person has reported, maybe not only that perpetrator, but as well maybe a family member may get involved to intimidate and terrorize to prevent her from staying involved in an investigation. So we want to safety plan for that and help to create safe space. Whereas maybe if the sexual assault took place in that person's home, some of the safety planning might have to look at how do we make the home safer to help minimize some of the trauma and some of the danger that might be anticipated, as well as maybe even considering how do we help this person relocate because the home would never be a safe option for them. One of the things when we think about dating violence, what that I see that happens a lot is that, particularly when we're talking about teen dating violence, is that the level of violence that goes on oftentimes is not taken as serious as it may be. I hear people talk about how the violence is maybe it's puppy love or an infatuation, and people minimize it. And so we need to recognize that it can be minimized, and how do we help with the safety planning in a way to build a network of safety support for that person, so that those supports around them actually take it very seriously. I was talking with a person working in a program not too long ago who was talking about teen dating violence that had gone awry, and the victim of the teen dating violence had actually been shot, and we were having that conversation about the seriousness of how, for that person, her family basically, they didn't think that young man was an appropriate person for the girl, and that there was some behaviors they didn't like, so they pressured her to end the relationship, but didn't recognize the safety that went along with all of that, and so the safety planning didn't take place. And so I just say that to just help people to recognize how serious this can be. The other part in there with dating violence that we have to look at is some of the technology and how that gets used, in particularly social media and the social communities that people are a part of in these days, that they can use those tools to vilify that victim and isolate that person, and also then through retaliation, so that that person actually feels more alone. And it sets up a dynamic where more people are involved, helping to terrorize this person, the victim of dating violence. And that raises a point, and I think this carries across all of the different aspects of safety planning, is how important it is for us to recognize technology as one of the areas that we need to look at as we're doing safety planning. And then stalking, as we look at stalking and safety planning for stalking, one of the things that we need to recognize, and so I know I've worked with a lot of victims over the years where the stalker has been an intimate partner, but there are also those that have been stalked by somebody, and it's somebody that they actually don't even believe they know. So there are times where that stalker could be somebody that, for whatever reason, they develop an infatuation and a connection, an obsessive type connection with a person, and it could be something, maybe they were in a convenience store and were buying at the soda machine together and getting a soda at the same time, and then the victim ended up saying something nice to that person. So they've had maybe some minimal contact, and based on that minimal contact, that stalker has built that into something bigger and become infatuated and obsessed with that person. And so one of the things when we think about stalking that's really important is not only some of the other safety methods about, safety practices that we have around creating a safe space and the resources and where can you go and those kinds of things, and knowing your options. So we also need to recognize that in order to be able to show that it really is stalking, we need to be documenting that. So along with the safety planning tools that we might use in all other instances, we also need to incorporate a documentation strategy so that we can actually help that survivor support and show that this is a very real situation that is escalating on them, and they can actually help enlist other community practitioners to help be responders and taking it serious as well. Sometimes some of the ways that stalking play out, again, it may not, one incident by itself may not feel very big, but as it adds up together, you start to see the pattern, and it starts to be quite dangerous and very serious. So when we think about strategies for safety, it's important for us to think about a few different aspects of strategy. And as we look at that, we want to think about protection strategies, how somebody seeks to prevent and respond to the physical violence, and in that we want to think about, so what are their strategies if they choose to stay in that relationship? A lot of times when we think about our tools and our resources as advocates, they're often designed for that person to leave the relationship. And what we know about victims of domestic violence is that oftentimes mostly what they want is they want the relationship, they just want the violence to stop. And so we need to recognize that and actually respond to that as a part of the strategies that we're doing safety planning for. So if that survivor does not want to leave that marriage or leave that relationship, we need to work with them to develop some strategies that support them while they stay in that relationship. And in that, it may be, brief, movements out of, harm's way and away from that person and out of the house or out of their pattern of the way they function in their life, but it still is done in ways that they're continuing to stay in their relationship. But I would also say that we want to also be, as we're looking at options, that we're also recognizing that one of their strategies is to actually leave the relationship. And so we don't ignore that as a strategy, but we recognize that that's only one part of a larger strategy for those who want to stay. So then when we think about leaving strategies, one of the things I think that's really important for us to recognize is that as a part of either making that decision to leave or actually leaving, that from our experience in our advocacy work and all of this work in the field, what we know is that that's when a person becomes at greater risk for potentially being killed or a very dangerous harmful assault to take place. And so as we think about leaving strategies, just the fact that we're starting to talk about it, we need to really recognize the risk to lethality and incorporate that as a part of that strategy. And then also we want to recognize our time frame, that as we think about the strategies, there's going to be strategies of how do you respond in the moment, and then what do you do kind of in some of the long term. When I think about the different time frames, some people think, well, if only I can get out of this relationship, then it's done. So I just need to have a strategy to get me through like the next couple weeks, and then it's done. And, some of that risk can go on for a very, very long time. I was telling one of my coworkers the other day about one woman that I worked with, and she was severely assaulted 5 years after she was out of the relationship. And so when we think about strategies, we need to recognize that the strategies really cover long spans of time. And then in there, some of what we want to do is planning, how we're doing planning. So one woman I worked with a few years ago, she talked about one of her biggest fears was that she would not be able to walk away from the marriage with her children. And so as we were developing some short-term strategies to the immediate safety risk, we were also developing some long-term strategies for her in terms of how does she document and prepare for exiting with her children. And so the strategies actually took place, we were looking maybe a couple years down the road in some of those strategies. The time frames we want to keep thinking about how those, what's needed for this particular individual in terms of what does she want and how can those be accomplished, which will cover a range of different time spans. So as an advocate doing this work, when we're doing safety planning, one of the things that I know is within our program, we are set up to where we will do safety planning with people that we're working with. And as I've worked with programs across the years through technical assistance, I will go in and I'll visit a program, and there are times that I will show up and they will say, yes, we do this intake, then we do the safety planning, and then we do X, Y, and Z. And what I start to realize is that safety planning is accomplished in the beginning, and then it really doesn't get revisited. And so when we think about our role as an advocate, is that we talk with that person about her current situation and their needs for safety, but we also incorporate into our practice a way to continually revisit that. And we incorporate it into multiple conversations and then periodic revisiting of the formal process. So that, as what I was saying before, that we really incorporate it in a way so that survivor or that victim actually have a way to incorporate it into their thinking in a way that that becomes more second nature to that survivor, so that they don't have to, oh my gosh, something's happening, let me pull up this safety plan I've got in my purse. That it actually becomes incorporated in their mind, so they know, oh, this is happening, I need to move in this direction to get closer to this door, because if I go out this door, my car's out there, and once I get in, I lock the doors, and then I call this resource person. So it becomes second nature to them on how to respond. Then we also want to think about how we assist that victim and survivor with accessing emergency shelters and the civil legal remedies and the other community support. And so when we think of that, a lot of that's going to be some of the practitioners that are going to be out there and the services that are available. So how do we help, as an advocate, how do we help them access emergency shelter? And and in some instances, it might not only be like making a phone call, it's like, how do you even transport to that shelter? And, what are some of the civil and legal remedies that are available to you? And with those civil and legal remedies, how effective might they be based on what we know that's happening with those civil and legal remedies in our area? As well as what are some of the potential consequences. And I know for myself, one of the biggest things that terrified me about getting a protection order was the fact that the order had to be served. And that whole idea of someone, of a sheriff or someone going to my ex-husband and handing him these documents and serving him them, I envisioned it as, poking the bear, that I was basically going to be provoking a really dangerous situation. So we need to have that kind of a conversation. So then how do we safety plan about that? So if this protection order is going to be a helpful tool, then how do we help that person be prepared for when that happens? And how do we work with, how do we get notified that those papers were served? And how do we create the safety plan to help prevent any harm to happen as a result of the service of the documents? And then the community supports. What other community supports might be out there? And it might be some emergency assistance, like maybe emergency assistance that'll pay for a bus ticket. It might be community supports in terms of friends and relatives that will also offer assistance and help, having a place to go and park a car in a garage and hang out with a girlfriend for a few days and let things simmer down, and then get clear-headed and make, some decisions about the next step. So we want to go through and help them look at all of those different options and how do they access them. And so some of it might be that you help them reach out and communicate with some of these resources and learn firsthand and meet some of the practitioners who may be responding to them, as well as helping them to think about how they have a conversation with their sister about, I may need to come and show up on a moment's notice, and how do we do that if you're not going to be home? Those kinds of things. And then think about those long-term safety planning and safety strategies. And so when we think about that long-term, so what are your other options behind or beyond that immediate response? And so that's where, maybe that person may decide that they're going to start preparing for getting a divorce and how to retain custody of their children and laying down the groundwork for that. Maybe it's looking at other housing, and in that situation it may mean relocating outside of their existing community and looking at other options somewhere else. And as we do all of that is the long-term advocacy, which in there, one of the things that's important is how to have some consistency in the advocacy. And now many of our tribal communities, we have a small number of advocates, and it might be limited to 1 or 2 or 3 advocates, and in some situations, might be even a few more advocates. But in whatever way possible, we want to try to have, as we're doing long-term advocacy with somebody, that we try to ensure that it's the same advocate, so that that person isn't coming back and repeating things and feeling a frustration because there's other advocates that, they've talked with someone else and kind of went through this, and then they're saying it again, and it feels like, aren't you guys listening to me, or aren't you talking to each other? And in some cases, some of that advocacy might cross with a systems-based advocate. So maybe tribal law enforcement might have an advocate, or it could be a victim specialist through the FBI or BIA, or even a victim specialist through the prosecutor's office. So when we think about our role as an advocate, as a community-based tribal advocate, we want to make sure that we're communicating with those systems-based advocates in a way of, you initially responded and on the scene and did safety planning, and how do we communicate and cooperate with each other in a way that respects this victim's autonomy, their privacy, and their choices, as well as making sure that we have a seamless way that we're working together. So our role as an advocate is to recognize nothing is rigid, and that things change, and that if we did formal advocacy yesterday, that something could have happened last night and changed some circumstances and require, thinking to move things out, step up the plan in some different ways. So we also need to be really clear in terms of how the situation changes, and work at being very flexible in our ability to respond. So as we're doing safety planning, we want to make sure that we're gathering information, and in that we want to recognize, so what has this person done in the past? They might have had safety planning done with them by somebody else. Maybe they were in a different community, or in a previous advocate, or even a systems-based advocate, but at some point there might have been some previous safety plans that have taken place. And so we want to ask that survivor, so what have you tried? How did that work? Would you try it again? And what was that person's reaction? So that abuser, that offender's reaction to what that person did, and gather that information and that experience. And so when we talk about trusting that survivor as the expert in their own safety, that our role is to facilitate them to recognize all of this. And so by asking these questions, it's going to educate us, but it's also going to educate them. Because in the midst of the crisis, they may not have stopped and thought about all of these pieces before. They've been dealing with some crisis and probably some chaos in their lives. And so they haven't sat and thought, well, how well did that work? And would I try it again? And what was, was this reaction just this kind of, reaction that this offender would have done on any case, or did this reaction, was it more escalated based on their reaction to what we tried? So by asking the questions, we're educating that survivor in recognizing what's going on as well. So we want to identify current safety plans. And so, so what have they looked at in terms of thinking about in terms of their protection and staying and leaving strategies? And what's the time frame for their strategy? So are they taking some steps to communicate with the school about the children that haven't quite gotten there, and they plan on doing that next week or in 2 weeks? And do we need to make some adjustments to that? What are some of those personal and public resources that they've identified that are available to them? And in there, how do they feel about those resources? So as I've worked with advocates over the years, one of the things that they'll say, we give them this information, and then oftentimes people aren't asking, well, do you think she would use those resources? How does she feel about them? And so we want to recognize, as we're looking at what those personal public resources are, we want to know what are the ones that she will use that feel right for them. And they might say, well, I'll try this person first, but then, I don't want to take this to my mom. I don't, she'll get stressed over it, or maybe she'll judge me, or whatever the reaction they might perceive. So we want to help them recognize that some of these are going to be better resources than others, and in that, who will they go to first, and then who will they go to next? And then how does she think that offender is going to react to those strategies? And it's important to find out what that person thinks, that how they will react. I know in one situation in my own personal life, one of my strategies was to call the police. And how did I think he was going to react? I thought he was going to be very, very angry. And I called the police, and he had an interaction with law enforcement, and within minutes, he showed up at my house. And I had to have a strategy for that. So knowing that I believed that was going to happen, then it helped for us to put in place the next step. And then with that, then we ended up with law enforcement involved a second time. And by that time, the next strategy that we had to do was to have somebody witness that I wasn't a crazy person. And I say this because the situation actually was playing out to where he had kidnapped my kids, and I was trying to get them back. And in that process, he had my kids for 3 months. And so when the police showed up the second time, my children were screaming that they wanted their father. And in that, so I'm looking like the crazy person, even though I had physical custody and legal custody awarded in our divorce. And so the next strategy after that interaction with law enforcement was for me to go to the Child Protective Services and to inform them of what was going on and the steps that I'd been taking and who had been working with me. And the reason for that step was so that it could be documented and witnessed that this was not a crazy person here, that it was a rational person who had all these legal rights to do this. And even though it was witnessed that my children were screaming and stuff by the police, that through this other office, they were documenting that actually my kids were calm in my presence, and it set up another dynamic. It was a long-term strategy so that I could keep my children. So we really want to think about how that person is going to react and then what next. And so some of it is the immediate response and then the next few steps beyond it, and may even lead to some of those longer strategies, those longer-term strategies in terms of things that might not take place for 6 months, a year or two. So we want to work with them to strengthen their safety planning. And so we want, one of the things that's so important is to recognize how relevant the options are. And I've talked a little bit about that, about making sure that these are options that this person wants to use, as well as based on our own knowledge and experience in the community as advocates, that we know that they're good, viable options. So if we know protection orders are not being enforced in our area, then it's not going to be a really solid, viable option. So we need to recognize that. And then being really clear about some of the potential consequences that can occur by using or not using some of these options. And then what are some of the things that need to happen in advance to make these options readily available. And those are the situations where you're calling your friend or sitting down with your friend or your mother or your cousin who's going to be helping out and explaining what's going on. And maybe it's that you get on the phone and you act like you're having a conversation, but you use some code words so that they know that you're in trouble and you need someone to call the police. And you want to analyze, and so you want to look at, how does this work? These are the potential consequences, the potential risks, and if you don't use them, these are the potential consequences and the potential risks, and help them think some of those things through so that they can make some choices that fit for them. And I say that about them making choices that fit for them because the reality is that they're the ones who live with all of this. So at the end of the day, we go home to our own families as advocates, and at the end of the day, she's living with these decisions. So it has to be her decision, not our decision. So we really want to recognize that and support them to weigh all of the positives and the negatives in there. And in there, and I've talked about making sure they're dynamic and that it's their choices. And so we also want to recognize that law enforcement is one of those tools and those resources there. And in that, that they also are one of those tools and resources that may help in terms of some long-term, but may not always be helpful in the short term. So if there's a protection order and there's enough way to help to see that an order's been violated, then it's one of those things where it's possible that that officer may be able to go and arrest that offender. But in some instances, that officer may only end up being able to file an incident report and not have anything to be able to do an arrest. And we need to recognize that, and that's one of those things that we help them analyze the benefits and the consequences of that. And if that offender is very responsive and law enforcement shows up and talks to them about something that happened and is going to explore what when she called the police and that officer is going to go and explore that by talking to that abuser, and that intimidates the abuser to calm down and settle down and not do anything more, that might be a really helpful thing to happen. And that's where that survivor's knowledge of that abuser is going to be helpful. And we always want to make sure we provide follow-up. And that's that thing where I'm talking about you do a few points in time where you do formal protection order or safety plans, and then you incorporate this into some of the informal conversations. And so you want to make sure things fit. So if I were doing safety planning one day, I would work at setting up a time shortly thereafter to have another conversation to talk about the safety plan we came up with. Because in the moment, it might feel like a really good idea, and then she goes home and she thinks about it for a day or two or a few more days, and thinks like, holy cow, what am I getting into here? Am I starting to do a plan that's not going to work here and make things worse? So that follow-up is going to help her to really think about how to, what are those risks in there, and what consequences that she can live with, and what's going to be most effective to her. So she may want to change some things, and your follow-up will give her the opportunity to have support in thinking through how to make some of those changes. So when we think about safety, we also want to think about facility safety. So I've mentioned safety like at our home and where she goes and things like that. The other thing for safety is that we want to think about safety within the facilities of the emergency shelter that we may be running, or the crisis advocacy program we may be running, or transitional housing program. That's another place that she goes. And we're finding that there are a few incidents while the offender is targeting that victim, the reality is some of them are emboldened enough to want to come and intimidate the advocate. So we also, as a program, want to think about how do we create safety. If that survivor is coming to our program, is that survivor going to be safe in our program, whether it's an emergency shelter or coming in for a meeting for crisis advocacy? If that person comes and parks their car there, is that car going to be seen from the street and seen in a way to where the abuser can just say, well, I'm just going to watch the advocacy program because I'll see her coming and going from there, or I'll come over to this other area and watch the shelter. And I know a lot of our programs say, well, we're going to keep the address identity hidden. But in our tribal communities, we all know that many things are not hidden. So the reality is that even though we might not be publishing the address, once we start serving people, that address starts to be very public. So we want to think about ways that we can make things as safe as possible. And so one shelter program I worked with is that when they had people in their program, they had a gate that was kind of a private gate. And so those that were staying in shelter, their cars were parked inside the gate. So if someone drove by the shelter, they didn't see the cars. Another place is that they had the program nestled. It was a crisis advocacy program, and they had it nestled within multiple programs. So in order to get at the crisis advocacy program, you had to go through the front desk and walk past two other programs before you got to the locked doors where the advocacy program was. And then going out the back way, there were locked doors also, and then you had to walk through another program to get out. So it was kind of nestled within. So even if that survivor's car was parked out front, you wouldn't know which program that survivor was visiting, and that survivor was in a locked space. If that person came into one of the other programs, would not be able to access and just walk into the advocacy program. Technology safety is an important piece that I think that requires a lot of attention. I've talked to many advocates about technology safety and about, they need to understand Facebook, they need to understand Twitter, they need to understand how computers work, and people say, I really don't like technology, that's not my stuff, I'm an old dinosaur, and they push away from it. And in today's modern age with technology, as advocates, we really have to have a decent understanding of how technology gets used to abuse and can be used to monitor and set up victims to attack them and to harm them. So we need to have some self-education that goes on, and I know a few programs that have reached out to their tribal information technology, their IT staff, to come in and do some in-services to help them understand a little bit about some of the technology. But I also think it's important for advocates to build a network of techie advocates. So if you know advocates that have a strong knowledge of some of the technology, you can lean on them to help them, have them help you get educated about social media and how that gets used and how to access and set up an account. So sometimes even being able to play with it a little bit to build an understanding is good. And then also just being able to understand some of the different ways that technology can be used. So as you're looking at technology safety, one of the things is to find out how much knowledge that abuser might have around the use of technology, as well as not only that person's knowledge of technology, but do they have access to someone else who has knowledge that might, help them out with something. And so as you're safety planning, you want to explore that so that you can actually start to safety plan with that. And then advocate safety. So we've seen where some instances where some offenders have become a little bit emboldened, and it's important as we're doing this work, we recognize again that the offender is targeting that victim, but as they are targeting that victim, that they may turn around and move their sights toward the advocate. And so we want to have some practices as advocates to help keep things a little safer. And so just some real basic things about making sure you have a way to where if you're working in an office alone, is there a time of day that you would lock that door? And do you have some ability to communicate with someone else quickly while you're in that office alone? Or even if you are in an office with someone else, I think it's helpful to have some code words if you are in a small office, well, in any office, and there's, for those that are working around you, that you have a code word that if you say, public address system or, the internet's offline or something like that, that the other staff know this is a situation to call the police. So that you don't have to tell them, I'm just having a conversation with this person who walked in, or this is turned and I need you to go call the police now, which could escalate things really fast. So the code word can help to get the police there without somebody being alerted of it. And then just some basic things about getting in the car and locking the doors. And I've lived in really small rural communities for a lot of years, and we used to have a practice of leaving our car keys in the car. I mean, who's going to steal the car the better? So you always knew where your keys were because they were in the ignition. Well, as an advocate, I mean, there's some basic things of making sure the keys are out of the car. When you get in the car, first thing you do is you lock the doors, even before you put the keys in the ignition, because if somebody's going to come at you or jump at you, better to have the door locked than to be trying to start the car first. And then always letting someone else know where you're going is an important practice, and when you're expected to be back, so that if you haven't come back, then the other person in the office can call law enforcement and have them go do a safety check for you. So there are some other safety planning tools I just want to draw your attention to. Redwind has 3 safety planning tools on our website, and if you go onto our website and you look for resources, and in that section it says template resources. We have a domestic violence safety plan, a teen dating violence safety plan, and a transgender safety plan. And then the National Center on Domestic Violence, Domestic and Sexual Violence, they have an awesome list of safety plans. So I put their website up there as well for you. And they have some guide books for victims that also would be good, such as Safety Leaving Abusive Relationships, a guidebook for victims, Battered Wounds, Protective Strategies, Stronger Than You Know. And then they have an advocate's guide, and then they have a guide safety planning for stalking, campus safety planning for, those that are students, and several other resources. So I'm just going to go ahead and stop there and see if there are any questions or comments that people may have. And while people are typing, I just want to also just remind you that the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, they are recording this webinar, and so it takes them maybe a week or so to get it pulled together, and they will provide it to Redwind. And so with the holidays and everything, I think that probably around the end of the first week in January, we'll have it up on our website. And I would say we'll send out a notice to everybody so that you can know that it's on our website if you want to share it with a coworker or with someone else, or even just review it yourself. So I see that Wallene asked, asked. So then should we add in our policies that we will revisit safety plans? And I do think that's a good idea because you might develop it in your regular practice, but then as staff people change, you want that next person in who doesn't recognize the importance of doing it, that is going to happen more than one time with each person. Are there other questions or comments?
I just want to note that I've unmuted the lines of the 3 people on the phone, so if you'd like to ask a question over the phone, your line's been unmuted.
And those that are not on the phone, you can type it in the chat box. And I see someone else is typing as well, so we'll hang on for another couple minutes.
This is Wallene. I just want to say, being new to the program and learning it, I really enjoyed listening to it and got much better understanding of safety plans, and especially the importance of revisiting and doing them. Because I was under the impression you do one and then you file it away, But thank you.
You're welcome, Wallene. Lots of programs think that you do one and file it away. And that's why it's so important to talk about this. I see that Nancy has asked if we can download the slides. If you go on to Redwind's website, on the opening page of the website, it talks about our web trainings, and then there's a link in there to take it to the description of the web training. And the PowerPoint slides are there on that second screen on the website, and you can download them there. And if you have any issues, just send us a contact form, a message through our website, and we can email it to you as well if you have any issue getting it off our website. Any other comments? Okay, we have someone else typing right now, and so we'll just give it another minute. And it was a thank you. Okay, well, let's go ahead and wrap up for today, and I just want to thank everybody for being a part of this webinar today. And as I mentioned, that we will post it on our website, and it'll be available for you to share with your coworkers or to review it at your leisure at another time. And we'll send you a notice on that. And we had hoped to have a web training in this series on confidentiality. We've got everything prepared. We've just still been trying. We've got a co-presenter that would present on that with me, and we haven't been able to pin down a date, so I'm expecting that webinar will be happening in the spring. as well as we're going to be planning some more webinars for next year, so we'll be letting you know what that schedule is as soon as we know what that schedule is. So thanks, everybody, and I hope you all have a happy holiday and a great rest of the day.
Goodbye.
Bye.